Welcome to Gever Hakam, where the wise get wiser. Well, today we're actually going to get started with our Hebrew alphabet. So we're going to be learning not only just the first letter of the alphabet, but we're also going to study or take a quick look at the entire alphabet. That's going to be helpful just to give us a bit of a familiarity with the whole alphabet. And I hope that by the end of learning the entire alphabet, it will just be burned into your mind. You won't even have to think twice about the alphabet. But also in this lesson, we're going to look at the first letter a little more closely, how it's written, how it's used. Also a few key words that start with this letter. And we're even going to look at one key verse from Genesis, a very popular one, and read it together and interpret it just a little bit. So let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. Well, now we're getting started with our first letter, Aleph. But before we actually jump into our letter and learning about this, I do actually want to give you just a bit of a word of encouragement. This is not going to be easy. Learning another language is always difficult, but it is doable for everyone. Anyone can learn another language, especially Biblical Hebrew. And really the benefit is that we get to study God's word and it will enrich our lives and our families. So I hope that you will take this serious. Studies have shown that the best way to learn is actually with multiple ways of engaging the topic or the subject. So obviously we're watching a video here, we're listening, but I would say pull out a pen, a piece of paper or a pencil and write. Practice along, and this will really help to activate the memory and allow you to learn this a little bit quicker and for it to stick and stay with you long term. I would also even add to this one other element, and that is teaching. Teach somebody else what you've learned. This is probably the best way to remember something, is that you communicate it and teach it to somebody else. So grab a friend, talk to your spouse, a child, a grandchild, wherever it is, and tell them what you learned. Tell them about the letter Aleph and the verse that we get to talk about. Or maybe just start with a few of those key words. Whatever it is, you can make this really a part of your life. And rather than just some random thing that you're doing or watching online. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the letter Aleph and the alphabet. Now, we're not going to talk about this too broadly or in detail, but actually, you may not know this, but the English alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet have the same roots. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the Getting Started video, but the letter A in English is what turned into the letter A from that early original version from the Proto-Sinaitic or the Phoenician Paleo-Hebrew script. So this is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet as well. And it's called the Aleph. Aleph. And I mean, think about it, right? We call it the alphabet, right? But in Hebrew, it's called the Aleph Bet, which is the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So this is our first letter, the Aleph. Well, let's talk about or practice the entire alphabet together. Okay, so I'm going to do it quickly here, and then we're going to do it slowly together. All right, so this is the full alphabet with just the consonant letters, no vowels. Remember, I mentioned that in our Getting Started video. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. And that is our alphabet. So let's go through them a little slower, okay? So we have Aleph, Aleph, Bet, Bet, Gimel, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet, He, He. Vav. Vav. Zayin. Zayin. Chet. Chet. Tet. Tet. Yod. Yod. Kaf. Kaf. Lamed. Lamed. Mem. Mem. Nun. Nun. Samik. Samik. Ayin. Ayin. Peh. Peh. Sade. Sade. Kof. Kof. Resh. Resh. Sin. Sin. Shin. Shin. Tav. Tav. All right, now all together again more quickly. And if you can, try to follow along, but just try to listen. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Peh, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. We'll do it one more time. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Peh, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, and that is our alphabet. Here we go. All right, well, like I said, we're going to be talking about our first letter, the Aleph, the Aleph. So to get started, let's just talk about the form, what it looks like and how to write it. Well, first of all, as you see here, one of the first strokes, if you're going to, again, write it, and again, I do encourage you to take a piece of paper and a pen and follow along here. Well, you would make a straight line, kind of diagonal here, and then you would add these two little kind of side pieces. All right. Now, in some of the more traditional forms and even many of the modern variations, they don't exactly cross in the middle like an X for us in English. They're a little bit off-centered, as you can see here. So this is not accidental. All right. However, for simplicity, I always write it basically as an X. And as you might imagine, everyone has their own handwriting style. And so you're going to have to develop your own. So do as you would like to kind of make this look like the Aleph. But also don't feel bad if you just make it kind of very simple. Because this is going to be important for just getting a sense of the letter, what it's kind of supposed to look like, what's important, and what's not important. All right. And so in this particular form or font, you can see this is a little bit more fancy, right? But in its essence, this letter is really just the X, so to speak. Now, one thing I will mention here before we go too much further, and this will be helpful as we learn many other letters, I have this little dotted line here. And in terms of the Hebrew letters and writing, particularly in the biblical form, this would be the space that a letter is written within, okay? So this would be considered the whole space for a letter. Now, we are going to learn a couple letters that either go above the space or below the writing space, or even one that's sort of partial, okay? So keep that in mind, even though for this particular letter, it doesn't make a difference, but it will coming up shortly. Okay, well, now that we kind of looked at how it is written, let's think just a little bit about a couple different fonts. Now, that might sound a little bit weird, right? But just like in English, we have many different kinds of writing or letter forms. So you have like Times New Roman right on the computer. You have Arial and Calibri and, all sorts of, hundreds, probably thousands and thousands of different font styles. Well, a somewhat similar thing happens with Hebrew, right? So, for instance, the Aleph can look just a little bit different in one font. As you see here, it's a little bit more simplified, a little less fancy looking, right? Our previous one is the font that's more typical of the Hebrew Bible that we have nowadays. So this will be kind of like a more classic biblical font. This one, of course, is a much more simplified form. So you would see this type of writing in more modern stuff. Here's another one that's, again, kind of similar, maybe a mixture between fancy and simple. And I do also want to just bring up, now, I don't necessarily encourage you to memorize all these different ancient versions, but if you remember from Getting Started video lesson, we talked about this Paleo-Hebrew form. And so this is one of those early forms from about 600 BC to about 1200 BC. And so this is what the Aleph would have looked like in that time. Well, before that, our Aleph looked like a ox head. And actually, that's what the word means in Hebrew. And so both in Hebrew and Ugaritic and some other related similar regional languages in ancient times. And so you can actually see that, as I had mentioned in the development, these early proto-Sinaitic forms were pictures, right? They were hieroglyphics, basically. And they indicated a sound that was related to that picture. So this was a ox head, or an ox, an Aleph, basically. And so that became the kind of core sound, right? That's what the letter represented. But you can see in our Paleo form how this is really just kind of an ox head, right? But simplified. If you had to write, lines and lines or, official documents, this would be a little tedious to write over and over and over again. So you can see why somebody would want to simplify it to this Paleo-Hebrew form. So that's what happened. And of course, we eventually get our modern, or not modern, but the Babylonian square script version eventually after the exile. All right, well, let's talk about just a couple key things to know about the letter Aleph. And the first one is the Aleph is called a guttural letter. Okay, this is the class or type of letter it is. And in particular, this one is actually silent. That's, again, a little bit strange for us, but it's considered a silent letter. And as we learn our vowels eventually, which will happen after we learn a few consonants first, the vowel ends up carrying the sound for that letter. And even though, again, that might sound odd, it's a part of the spelling, it's a part of the word, it's a part of the tradition and history of the language. And so it is important. Now, one other thing we can mention about the Aleph is that the Aleph is actually used for the number 1. Of course, this form here of the number 1 didn't come till much, much later, right? And we use it in English and in some different traditions as well. But in ancient times, they didn't have this designation as a 1, so they used the first letter of the alphabet, the Aleph. And so you can see here, Genesis 1 would have been written Bereshit Aleph. Bereshit Aleph. And that meant Genesis 1, right? The first chapter of Genesis. Okay? Now, we don't know for sure how early the Aleph was being used. It does seem that it was for sure used in somewhat later Hebrew, like after the Babylon exile. But ever since then, it has been pretty commonly used as the number 1. All right, well, let's go ahead and learn a few key words. All right. Now, just to kind of help us out here, I have provided, of course, our Hebrew word in the Hebrew letters, the font, the form. But I also provide up here the English sound, or how you'd say it in English. And then down here, we have our translations into English. What does that Hebrew word mean? So let's take a look at these 2 key words. And these are, of course, very important ones. So the first one here is pronounced Elohim. Elohim. And the second one is El. So Elohim, El. El. Elohim. Now you'll see that Aleph there in both of them, right? Starting the word. Okay? Now in these ones, as we'll learn later, the Aleph is silent, so it takes our vowel sound, which again, we're going to learn a few lessons from now. So let's just focus on the Aleph and getting a sense of the letters and the words. Okay? Now, these 2 words mean God or gods. Okay? So El over here is the singular, meaning one God, just God, or maybe just generically divine, right? God, something like that. Kind of like we use in English, to be honest. Elohim is the plural, meaning gods, plural, many gods. However, what's interesting is that in the Bible, the word used for the Lord God, right, Yahweh, God, Adonai, he's actually called Elohim, Elohim. Now, there's been lots of interesting debates and discussions over this, proposing that, God is actually many gods, or that it was just some kind of weird, grammatical thing. But in ancient times, it was very common to give something a plural in order to make it more majestic. So that is one possible reason. So it's not simply that he's God, El, though he is called El sometimes, El Shaddai, and so on. But Elohim would be like saying he's the highest or the greatest of gods, right? The greatest majesty. And we know that this is used of in the same way as Lord is, Adonai, which is the word for Lord, and it's actually in the plural as well. So it's actually my lords is what Adonai means. And so, so in a similar way, it's probably just communicating his greatness as the greatest of gods. There's also the possibility that in ancient times, they would sometimes use the singular plus the plural to communicate the greatest. So they might say like El Elohim, right? The God of the gods, right? Or Melech Melechim, right? King of the kings, right? King of kings. We even see this used with the book of Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, as you might have heard it. It's actually Sir HaSirim, right? So Song of Songs. And so that's just saying it's the greatest of all songs. So that's probably what's happening here with Elohim. So we have Elohim, which again means God or gods, and then El, which means God or the one true God, depending on who it is referring to. Now, like I mentioned, some folks will say that this implies that God is complex or that he's the Trinity. And while that certainly could be a part of it, as we find out from the rest of Scripture, there is an important principle called progressive revelation, which means from early on, God did not necessarily communicate everything about himself. And in many ways, we still don't know everything about God, right? We're still learning new things. But God communicated more about himself, say, through Noah, and then Abraham, and then Moses, and the law, and David, and throughout Israel's history. And then, of course, perhaps most greatly or marvelously through Jesus Christ, his son. And so this was the manifestation of God through man, through humankind. And so God reveals himself in different ways throughout time, and we learn more and more along the way. And so whether or not Elohim meant Trinity, I would say, according to the original human author, we might say probably not. That doesn't seem to be the indication that we find. But we also believe that Scripture is divinely inspired. So obviously God knows. God knows who he is and what he's like. So it's very possible and likely that God spoke and inspired those early writers to say and use words that actually meant a little bit more than what they fully understood. So I think it's a both and. That initially it probably just meant the greatest of gods, Elohim. But perhaps also in the divine inspiration sense, it was previewing or foreshadowing what would truly be revealed about God and his nature. All right, well, let's move on and talk about some more words here. Well, we can't get too far in the Bible without also coming across the word Adam. And Adam is the word for man. And it's also used for the proper name, Adam, of course. But as you see here, it starts with an Aleph. Adam. And that means man. Now, again, this can mean Adam, the specific person. It can mean man, as in a man. But it can also be used in the sense of mankind or humankind, humans generally speaking. And so this all three different ways get used in Genesis 1 through 3. And you'll see in Genesis 1, it gets used as sort of the general just mankind, humankind. Then in Genesis 2, it seems to be man, as in distinction from woman. And then you also see it used more in the sense of Adam, the person, especially in Genesis 3 and 4 and going forward. All right, well, let's learn another key word here, and that's the word Ish. So the word Ish is the word for man or husband as well. However, this one is a little bit more specific, as in man, a man. So it never really gets used in the sense of like humankind, okay? And that's why it also refers to husband. Now, unfortunately, there's no clear way to know the difference between the two. So sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous and you kind of have to understand the context. But oftentimes it's fairly understandable which one it's referring to. So Ish. And then we have the complement to Ish, Isha. And Isha is the word for woman, or likewise, wife. So Isha is woman and wife, or Ish is man and husband. So two very key words as well in the Hebrew Bible. So you'll see both of these quite often. All right, now let's talk about two other more familiar and important and family-oriented words. And the first one here is Av. And Av is the word for father. Now, you may have heard this called or in the form Abba, but Abba is actually the Aramaic version of father. Abba is a later Aramaic version. So the original Hebrew word for father was Av, not Abba, though Aramaic did become the primary and dominant language of the Hebrew people, the Israelite Jewish people. All right, well, how about mother? Well, the word for mother also starts with an Aleph. Aim. So aim is the word for mother. So we have Av, father, and aim, mother. Av, aim. All right. And let's look at two more words. And these are important words that are a little less concrete. So these might be a little more challenging. I would bet before long you can remember the words for Ish and Isha, man and woman. You'll probably remember the words for father and mother, Av and Aim. You'll definitely remember the word for God, Elohim. But some of these less concrete words are more challenging. So I would recommend writing these down and keeping a list, maybe making some flashcards. So we have the word here for one, as in number one, echad, echad, echad. Now, what's interesting about echad is it could mean one, as in one horse, or it could mean first, as in the first day. So this is what has brought about some debate and discussion, because in Genesis 1, there is a little bit of debate whether or not it's the first day or day one, and a few other places like Deuteronomy 6:4, where it says the Lord is one, right? Adonai Echad. And so there's a little bit of debate as to exactly how one, Echad, is used in a few passages. But in general, it's pretty standard. It just means one. All right, and before we head off to our Bible verse, I do want to bring up one word that's very, very, very common. And this, again, is a somewhat abstract word. It's the word asher, 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 asher. And asher is one of those connector words within a verse or a sentence. And so, as you can see here, it sometimes is translated that, or which, or who. And honestly, there's even a variety of other ways it sometimes is used. So you kind of have to be thoughtful about the context. But I would definitely say start with these three possibilities, because this will probably be 98% of its uses. All right, so the word asher. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into a Bible verse. So we're actually going to read our first Bible verse together. I know, right? Right off the bat, first day. Well, we're going to start with Genesis 2:24, a very well-known and famous verse. You may even have it memorized or could quote it from memory. So we're going to read through it sort of piece by piece, phrase by phrase, and pronounce it, translate it a little bit, and then I'll mention a few things about the phrase as well. So first of all, we have our beginning phrase of Genesis 2:24. We have Ya'azav Ish. Ya'azav Ish. Ya'azav Ish. Now, we just learned Ish. What does Ish mean? That's right, man. Man. So, man. Now, these words mean he will leave, Ya'azav, he will leave, man. Now, this might sound a little weird, and we'll pick up on some of these little grammatical, syntactical language things as we go. And this is actually why I want to start us reading right away. No need to wait till months or years down the road. We need to get right into it, okay? Well, in Hebrew, the word order is actually flexible. So this is the verb, Ya'azav, he will leave. And then Ish is actually the subject of that verb, meaning a man will leave. A man will leave. All right? So it's a little hard to get used to at first, especially for English speakers. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the key grammatical things to consider down the road. But for now, we're just trying to get familiar with the language and the alphabet, really. So one thing I do want to bring up is some of these extra things added to our root words. So the root word of Ya'azav is azav, which means to leave. And so the Ya on the front actually means he will or will. So he will leave, a man, right? A man will leave, okay? So we're going to pick up on a few of these things as we go so that by the end of learning our alphabet, you'll actually probably be able to read the Hebrew Bible pretty well. So let's continue on here. All right, so our next phrase is et aviv, et aviv, et aviv. So we have et aviv. And we actually see two Aleph words here. So the second one is one we just learned, right? Av, which means father. That's right, good. So father. Now, I point this out here because this is actually the word his added to the end of the word. And this is just one of the ways they do it in Hebrew. It's, again, a little bit odd to us as English speakers. But this is just the way they say his. So his father, his father. Now, you might have noticed that I didn't actually put a translation for this word, et. So what is that? What's going on here? Well, this is one of those pieces of Hebrew that's a little bit different from English. And this is, if we'll give it the fancy term here, direct object marker. But really, I like to say it tells us what is not the subject. So in other words, aviv is not the subject. So I can return back to our previous phrase here, ya'azav ish. And ya'azav ish is a man will leave his father, right? So this little marker here, et, doesn't get translated in English because we don't need it. And it doesn't mean anything for us. But in Hebrew, again, it basically just lets the reader know that this is not the subject. In other words, it's not saying his father will leave a man. No, that's not what it means. That's not what it's saying. It's a man will leave his father. And so this little et helps us to know that for sure. It makes it clarified. All right, so let's go to the next phrase. So we saw et aviv, a man will leave his father. Ve'et imo, ve'et imo, ve'et imo. All right, so ve means and. Et, again, we don't translate it. We don't need to. And then imo, imo. So you'll notice here that we have a couple things added to our words. So ve is the word and we'll talk about this when we get to this letter a little bit more, because and is very, 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 very common in Hebrew, way more than it's used in English. And then o is another way to say his, like we saw in the previous word as well with father. And then we see our word here for mother, im, or em, as it's normally pronounced. But here it becomes im, so imo, his mother. So, and his mother. So a man will leave his father and his mother. All right, well, let's continue reading here. So our next phrase is ve'davak, ve'davak, be'ishto, 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 ve'davak, be'ishto, ve'davak, be'ishto. All right, so we have a couple root words here. Davak, so and he will cling to. All right, so davak is the word that means cling to. That means and. So and he will cling. And then this one's a little tricky because it looks a little different from our original word isha, right? Isha, which means woman or wife. And the only real difference is that this letter has changed a little bit. Now, again, this might feel a little weird, maybe even a little overwhelming, but continue just following along, and we'll talk about it more when we get there, and we'll see it in many, many more verses. So again, by the end of our alphabet, this will be very familiar, and you probably won't even think twice about it. All right, so this phrase here means in, or perhaps to, with his woman or wife. So, and he will cling to, or with his wife, right? So it's saying a man is going to leave his father and mother, and he will, or in order to, cling with his wife. And then we see our next phrase here. We have vechayu levasar echad. Vechayu levasar echad. So we have here again, and this word means they will, or they will be. So, and they will be levasar, to be of flesh. So that's a little weird sounding. So let me break this apart here with our highlights. So, and they will be flesh, basar, and then echad, which means one, which we just learned, right? So this sounds a little bit weird in English, but we can kind of play around with it and make it sound right. So something like, and they will be one flesh, or they will be for one flesh, or we might even say they will become one flesh, okay? And so we have our phrase here, and, or vechayu levasar echad. All right, very good. Well, let's dial back and go through this kind of quickly. So we have ya'azav ish, and a man will leave et chaviv, his father, ve'et imo, and his mother, ve'davak beishto, and cling with his wife, vechayu levasar echad, and they shall be one flesh. So of course, this is a very important and key passage in the Bible. You've probably read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, maybe many times. But really Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are, especially Genesis 2, are really the whole foundation of everything, right? So Genesis 1 is really more the foundation of the natural order, right? The heavens and the earth, the animals and the creatures, right? But Genesis 2 is actually the foundations, the beginnings for everything human society. So we learn about man being given a task, right, to keep and to guard the garden. We find out that he is paired up with a woman, right? And that they become one flesh, right? And so that there's this implication that there is marriage and family, and presumably for the purpose of children, right? To fill the earth and to multiply and fill the earth. And many more foundations that we find in that chapter 2 of Genesis. And so this is one of those key ones, that it's not necessarily good for man to be alone, right? God made us for community. God made us to be social. And the family is the bedrock, is the foundation and the beginnings for all human society. And a healthy and properly aligned relationship between man and God and woman and God leads to a healthy and vibrant relationship between man and woman in the family. And so that's something that we can aspire to and ideally long for, right? Now, of course, we live in a post-Genesis 3 world, but, we can still long for the day when God restores a world more like Genesis 2, right? Where people are not broken in their relationships, where families are not broken, but they are filled with the peace and the love of God by His Spirit in a new heavens and a new earth. So that wraps us up for Genesis 2. So let's go ahead and practice our alphabet one last time before we move on to our next letter. So again, we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that's our lesson on the letter Aleph. I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll share something. So I'll see you next time.